Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sven, and in the last video we looked at exposure and contrast with the offset and contrast controls in DaVinci Resolve. And today we will discuss adjusting white balance, and there are many tools in Resolve to do that, so let's compare them to each other. So I think we all have a rough understanding of what white balance is, but let's at least talk about a handful of terms first so we are on the same page. So this line here in the CIE chromaticity diagram is called the blackbody curve, and it shows the temperature of a color in Kelvin. And this basically comes from heating up a blackbody until it emits light. The hotter it is, the brighter its emission gets. It starts from a dim red and goes to yellow and white until it reaches a point where it starts to glow bluish. And we can see the same thing here as we follow this line. We start in the red corner, approach the middle where the white lives, and then go towards the blue corner. So when we adjust the temperature of a color in the grading software, we should be moving along this line to achieve a realistic effect. And also, by the way, the term tint that you already know basically describes the deviation from this line towards either the green or magenta side. So the first thing that comes to mind when talking about white balance is the temperature and tint controls in a camera. And sometimes we can access those in DaVinci Resolve as well. Whenever something was shot in RAW, we have the option to modify those controls over here in the Camera Raw tab. And since this is the same thing that the DOP would adjust on set, it usually gives us the most natural looking results. But we don't have the Camera Raw settings with all of our footage, so we have to find a different solution for codecs like ProRes and DNX and such. Probably one of the first tools we spot in the color page are the temp and tint controls of the primary palette. And I guess we all started with those when we started color grading, but to be honest, those two usually don't look good. And the reason for that is that they are pretty arbitrary tools that are first of all designed for a display ready image, and usually we work in a scene space or working color space like for example ACES CCT or DaVinci Intermediate, and also they have no idea what the footage is they're applied on. It's just some specific gain operation that the developers of DaVinci Resolve came up with years or even decades ago, and they might have been good enough at the time, but nowadays we have way more sophisticated tools at our disposal. So let's have a look at some. And still to this day some people say you should adjust white balance with lift gamma gain or with the custom curves. And to make it quick, just don't. These tools are not really suited for white balance. They are nice for creative look development, but they are way too surgical for adjusting the overall temperature and tint, and they don't work anywhere close to how color temperature works. So let's move on. Probably one of the easiest ones would be the offset control. This one, as we saw in our last video, is a simple plus operation, but now we adjust the 3 color channels individually. And while we are in a logarithmic color space, this is actually not bad. The same thing as we saw with changing exposure is true for white balance. The offset works mostly pretty naturally, but has some slight inaccuracies in the blacks. But if you only adjust the white balance subtly, this is totally okay in my opinion. The benefit of this technique is that it is fast, and you'll see what I mean by that if we look at the next techniques. So since Resolve 17 we have the HDR palette, and this one, as we saw in the video linked above, is great for adjusting exposure. However, it introduces some weird hue shifts when we adjust white balance. And it doesn't matter if we do it on the global wheel or with the temp and tint sliders over here. They basically create the same image. Also, you might notice how some colors became a bit brighter or darker than before. In the past, we also already talked about linear gain, and I can't say it often enough. When we do this, we have to set the luma mix to 0, and I explained why in my full video about linear gain and the HDR Global Wheel. So if we adjust the white balance with linear gain, the results feel quite natural as well. The only downside is that it takes a while to set it up with the CST sandwich or the node gamma. However, the results, especially compared to the camera raw settings, are pretty good. And besides all the previous techniques, there's one that is probably superior to all of them, the Chromatic Adaptation OFX. First of all, this one comes with a bunch of different models to choose from. By default, it is set to CAT02 or CAT02, which is a pretty good model to adjust white balance. But you could also try out XYZ scaling or Bradford or any of the others. In my experience, they work great most of the time. And also this entire OFX is color space aware. So it looks at the timeline color space and applies the correct color space conversions inside to provide the most accurate results. But in order for that to work, you have to either tag it correctly here or in the project settings. And if you want to find out more about that, please watch my video on color space aware grading tools. The only downside with this tool, however, is that you have to apply it as an OFX and set it up, which takes a second. And also you might have to get used to the sensitivity of the sliders. So now let's quickly recap those options and compare them. For each technique we take the camera raw as a perfect reference. And the reason for that is that if the image has been well balanced from the start, this balance would have happened in the camera, and we would take this perfect balance for granted. So, as expected, the primary temp and tint don't do a great job for fixing the white balance, and they look way different than the camera raw. The offset does a well enough job to give us a nice balance and also not alter the brightness too much. We get a nice separation of different hues, and also, as we said earlier, it was really easy to use this tool. The HDR Global Wheel was equally easy to use, however the hue shifts create some uncanny colors, and also we can see a bit of brightening of certain colors. Linear gain does a nice job at preserving the brightness and also at creating separation. The downside, as we talked about earlier, is the time needed for setup and the danger of forgetting to disable Luma Mix. The Chromatic Adaptation OFX probably created the most natural looking results, really similar to the camera raw settings. But again, the time needed for setting it up is a downside. So what would I do? If I encounter a shot that is really badly balanced, I might try the OFX, because this one for sure can save the most extreme color casts where other tools just don't get. But so far I still do enjoy the offset the most, because it's just so easy to use, and for most adjustments during shot matching, it's totally good enough. But linear gain is definitely a worthy consideration, especially when you work with a fixed node tree where everything is already set up. So that's it for today. Let me know in the comments which method you prefer. And if you want to help out the channel, please consider subscribing and leaving a like on this video. And until then, I'll see you in the next episode.